since this is sort of brand new to us, if you have trouble seeing it and you want to see it, the best thing to do rather than divert right now is just email me and we can work out how to help you do that later. Okay, with that in mind, today's topic, there it is. Okay, and live transcript is going. Okay, so today's topic is name variations. And this is one of my favorite topics in genealogy because I deal with so many variations. The easy one is McKinney. Yeah, there we go. On the left-hand side are the ones that I have found in my name, research, McKinney, obviously. Then there's a space that will appear. Some databases have a space before the K, and they don't always index it properly, so you can't find it by putting in McKinney. Of course, there's alternate spellings. Then there are a lot of spellings that are based on the straight pronunciation of the name, Ma-ka-ni. Okay. I have also found two other names that are sort of interesting, but I don't have them in my personal genealogy. McQuinney is actually McKinney, and John McCain is John McCaney, which also comes out of the McKinney background. So this is the fun kind of thing. So my wife's grandfather, Isidor Kutkovsky, came over from Lithuania, 1901, and then the next year he brought the first of his three half brothers. His father had died and his mother remarried, and she had three sons, at least three sons that we know of. And he brought the first ones over, and their name was Kaniset. So you can see the different spellings I've come up with for Kutkovsky in my research. Some of them are obvious and some of them are not at all obvious. Kolkotsky, okay. And then look at the spellings for Isidore, okay. You can have the E, you can have an A, you can have you name it. But the Kanisets are the ones I've had so much fun with recently. They're my push the hill, anyway. One of the branches ended up naming themselves Kaniset, and one of the brothers ended up as Konarski. I gather they're both the equivalent in pronunciation in Lithuanian, Polish, Russian. But look at some of the ones down below. I like the one that has 3 Z's and thrown in. And because their older brother was older half brother was Kutkovsky, there's actually at least one record where they show up with the last name Kutkovsky. It's an immigration record, and I think they're trying to explain that their brother paid their way over and they don't want to have to use a different name than their brother used. Okay, so that's the fun of names. So here's where you find things. I don't know how much of this is useful. The top one is the Lynn City directory. You can see the spelling there. The next one illustrates a little problem we get into. That's the 1910 census. Would you like to be the person transcribing that to figure out what it actually said? The next one is Kolkotsky, which is the 1920 census, which I found because I searched Veronica. Okay, and then the last one's the 1935 Rhode Island census, where Isidore is sort of weird. So, this is what you find when you're doing the research. So let's look at simple name adjustments. So remember that how names are presented will change depending on the original document. We'll talk about common modifiers to help in searching. We'll talk about the fact that it's not always the same first letter, Kutkovsky, Kolkotsky. And we'll talk about soundex, sounds like, and similar. So these are the easy things to know. So we tend to think of Samuel McKinney, that's my great-grandfather. And if you're searching on Google and in many websites like newspaper websites, unless you put quotation marks around Samuel McKinney, Google will find Samuel Jones, who lives in McKinney, Texas, because all they're looking for is the two names on the same page on the internet. By putting it in quotation marks, Google says, oh, you want those two names next to each other. But if you look below that, you see that you get, suppose you had a list of all the soldiers who were in a particular regiment, it would be by last name first. So that's how you're going to find a person in a list. And often it's listed with initials, including middle initial. And going back, remember that married women were always a little bit treated differently. And it's not uncommon to have a married woman show up as Mrs. Samuel McKinney. So suppose you're searching for an obituary for your grandmother's father or your grandmother's brother. She's not going to show up as Mrs. Sarah McKinney. She may easily show up as Mrs. Samuel McKinney. He's survived by his daughter, Mrs. Samuel McKinney. Wildcards. They've really developed this pretty well, and in most databases you can use wildcards. There's a single character wildcard, and so for example, in the Veronica, by putting a question mark, I both get the English spelling Veronica and the Eastern European spelling Veronica with the K. I could put the question mark at the beginning. So question mark ARL gets Carl and Earl and Carl. Okay, those may be of interest. An asterisk in most databases means multiple characters. So Sam exclamation point will retrieve records that say Sam, Samuel, Samantha, or asterisk Kenny gets Kenny, McKinney, and McKinney with a space. Those are all coming up. One other point I want to make on that, just real quickly. In some databases, you can use more than one wildcard in the same name. Okay, and I will also say, I frequently will search with an asterisk and a large space. I have searched for Kutkovsky with an asterisk SKI. So if you have Kutkovsky, question mark gets me Kutkowski as well as Kutkovsky. Question mark at the end gets me both Kutkovsky and Kutkowska. Those of you with an Eastern European background will recognize that the A means the female and the I means the male. And a K with an asterisk SKI catches a wide variety of misspellings. My wife's grandmother was born Bardzikowski. The middle of that, the DZY, tends to show up lots of different ways for the same record. So by putting an asterisk there, I pick up a lot of different ways that gets spelled. And by putting their asterisk at the end, I do pick up people who have abbreviated the name as Bard. There are also people who have abbreviated it as Bardzik, etc. So a way to use and help things. Different first letters. We talked about Kutkowski sounds like Kutkowski in Polish. Jewish names often have different first letters. So the name may be Schwartz, but if you come from areas of Germany or France, the name may be Schwartz starting with a CH. Okay, so if you're having trouble, always be sure to try to figure out whether there are special spellings for that name. Okay, and always note when you find an alternate spelling because it may be used other places as well. So put down, that's why you keep that long list of the Canazet spellings. Now Soundex, this was a system used to code similar names in English. You took the first letter and coded the rest of the name by phonetic equivalent. It was first used in the it was developed in 1910. It was first used in the 1920s to code census records. So you could go to the National Archives and look up anybody who had a particular coding. So for example, the word Robert is coded R163, so is Rupert. And that's nice because Rupert and Robert are occasionally mixed in the. It works pretty well for Western European names, but not very well for Eastern European, and actually fairly poor for Southern European. These links will be on the website, but you can find your name code here, and there's something called the Dutch Mokotov Soundex, which is a system for Jewish names, and you can get that on JewishGen. If there's anybody of a Jewish background who's on the call who doesn't know about JewishGen, you want to. JewishGen.org is the real go-to site for people with a Jewish background. Phonetic equivalents. They depend on the context of the original language and the data set. So for example, Ancestry uses the Dutch Mokotov, whatever it's pronounced, to get the phonetic equivalent for Jewish names when it's in a Jewish data set, which is very good. So the idea of phonetic has to depend upon phonetic in what context. As artificial intelligence has allowed more definitions of equivalence, many sites have developed the idea of similar or equivalent. Ancestry has given us the example of hash, which as a last name is also commonly spelled hash with an E. And if you click that you want to look at similar, they will automatically pick up the E, which they would not pick up with either of the other methods. Okay, now we'll talk about things that are more difficult. So difficult to spell names, common names that are easily spelled, and other search situations. With names that are difficult to spell, recognize that's a problem. It has to be part of literally the fun of genealogy research to work them. I would not give up on the 1920 census because I knew that my wife's grandfather and his family should be in that census, and I found them. So we're going to talk about general spelling, ethnic peculiarities, and Anglicization. So last names, obvious alternate spellings, Kenny and Kenny, Robert, Rupert. A truncated spelling, Bard, Bardzik, Bardzikowski. So think about it logically in terms of your family and where they came from and what might be logical alternatives. I have had some luck with remembering to search the other members of the family. So it turned out that when I tried to find Cleophas Bombardier in my wife's French-Canadian background, okay, I discovered that for all the church records, that's the way he showed up. But for all of the administrative records, censuses, and all the rest, he used a completely different name. But I found that by searching the family, because the members of the family hadn't changed. First names, you have obvious alternative spellings, Veronica, Veronica. You have phonetic spelling, John and John. You have the female, male versions of spelling, for Francis, for example. And truncated spelling, if you are not familiar with it, in a lot of records back even into the 1800s, JNO was a common abbreviation of John. So depending on your ethnic background, familiarize yourself with any ethnic peculiarities. So in Polish, the I means the male, the A means the female. You have the patronymic McKinney, Ben. And if you're Spanish, you have Spanish background, quite normally the mother's name will show last. So that will be very difficult to find unless you're careful researching. First names, a very powerful one is what's called the Scottish Convention, although many other cultures use it. In the Scottish Convention, when my wife and I get married, the oldest male is named after my father. The next male is named after her father. The oldest female is named after her mother. The next female is named after my mother. And that meant, for example, in the late 19th century, that my Lilly ancestors ended up with a generation where there were 8 John Lillys in the same generation, all of whom had the same grandfather, named John. If you come from a different alphabet or a different area where their sounds are different, try to familiarize yourself. How would you anglicize jokes? Okay, and then the next word is actually Stephen in the actual Greek language. So you've got to familiarize yourself with how to handle that. Okay, anglicized. A person may want their name to be more American. When my grandmother introduced me to her family, she mentioned that one of her grandmothers was named Mooney and spelled M-A-U-N-E-Y. And I sort of said, okay, Mama, that's what you say, that's fine. Later, when I did the research, I discovered they had immigrated as German Munis, M-U-N-I, and they had changed their name to make it more American, but they didn't change the pronunciation. My wife is French Canadian in part, and that part is Menard, which became Maynard. And actually, about the time I married her, there was actually a belief that they were English in background, even though they were totally French Canadian. You may want a name that's easier to pronounce or easier for your employer to get. Some names automatically are changed. If someone was named Jorge, he would be George. Of course, here in California, that means as George, it's not infrequent that I'll go someplace and they'll say, they start me off as Jorge. Boleslaw, good Polish name, is the same name as William. So if your ancestor was named Boleslaw on the immigration record, it's a pretty good chance he's William in the American records. And then Metzger is the German word for butcher. And it was not uncommon for someone to come over with the name Metzger and end up with the name butcher. Sometimes government employees are standardizing. Schmidt may be spelled Smith. And by the way, for those who haven't been through the immigration discussion, the name that was on the immigration record at Ellis Island was written there by an officer of the steamship that brought the person over. The person who was the immigration officer would verify that you were who you said you were, but virtually never change the name in Ellis Island. It may not have been written down correctly in Bremen or wherever the person was leaving from. And of course, there are some standard things that happen. Sutherland has pretty universally been made Sutherland in this country. Dealing with women's names. Women have many last names. I'm sure that's true for those of you who are participating. They may use their maiden name, even if they're married or divorced. They may use a first marriage name, even if they've been married more than once. Very frequently, I will find an ancestor whose husband died when she was like 60, who remarried, and then when she died, the name that's on her obituary and on her tombstone is her first marriage name, not her second marriage name. Living with name. You know, if you were in rural Virginia and the census taker came around, who was probably your local postmaster, and you didn't happen to be married, okay, and he said, "What is your name?" and you would say your first name and then your husband, the man you lived with's name. You wouldn't tell him you weren't married. And quite frequently, when someone remarries, they use their latest marriage name, not their birth name. Children's names are more reliable where there are stepfathers, but do recognize that children may appear like in a census with their stepfather's name or their mother's maiden name and not their actual birth name. When there are modifiers, whatever they are, search without the modifier. or search with things all crushed together. Van Cleef could be indexed as Van Cleef. And do remember to add additional family members, particularly with Google. First names in families run from generation to generation. I was doing research with the McKinney family circa 1750. And at that time, they were living in Western Virginia around Lynchburg. There were 3 McKinney families there. My family was the John William Josephs McKinneys. That's what people got named their children. One of the other families was Colin Archibald Daniel. So I knew if I ran into Colin, I didn't have to worry about that being my family. Nobody ever called anybody in my family Colin or Archibald or Daniel. When you look at names, be sure to check grandchildren as well as children in trying to determine whether a particular family is from your particular group. One odd caution, prior to 1900 in censuses and other places, the terms senior and junior were often used to mean the older and younger person in the same area with the same name. So if I've got John Smith Sr. and 3 pages later in the census, I've got John Smith Jr., that doesn't necessarily mean those 2 people are related. First names. Children are often named after a recently dead sibling or relative. If you've done a lot of research, you've almost certainly run into a case where you have Joseph McKinney born in 1823, and then in the next record, you have Joseph McKinney who was born in 1833. And what that may mean is the first Joseph McKinney died, and there was a subsequent child. Names often the same as a father or uncle. Names may be after an unrelated famous person. And I was trying to track down a weird name in my family and discovered it was the name of the itinerant preacher who would go around that area circa 1810. Child's first or middle name could be from an ancestor. Child's name may be from a neighbor. There are periods of time when people would name their child after a relatively wealthy neighbor with the idea that at the time of the christening, there would be money that would be provided. Watch for nicknames. Polly, which may be Molly, which may be May, all come from Mary, and occasionally from Martha. And then abbreviations, WM for William, JNO for John, THOS for Thomas, DANL for Daniel. Do familiarize yourself with abbreviations. People may use their middle name. And of course, there's always the appearance of the foreign equivalent. Whenever you get more information, new spellings, new family members, new locations, use that to go back and repeat earlier searches. Okay, I'm trying to not be too technical here. There are what are called Boolean modifiers. So if you put a plus in front of the name James, it means when searching, the name James must be present on the web page. It can't be possibly present. It's similar to the Boolean term and there's no space after the plus sign. You'll see some examples in a minute of how these are used. Minus sign means the reverse. It cannot be present. And the or means exactly that you want either Kenny or Kenny with the I or the E. Okay. And if you use the word and, not, or, it has to be inside the parentheses. This is mostly applies to Google, but there are other sites where it applies. So let's say you have a very common name. You can add nicknames. Those Johns became known as everything from Miller John to Rattlesnake John. You can add titles. If somebody, and this would be common because if you think about it, these would be things that would help other people distinguish which John it was. You can search with other members of the family. You can search with terms like obituary or married. And I use the minus sign a lot because with a common name, what happens is you get lots of stuff and you discover that you really don't want that stuff. So you can put a minus sign in. and get rid of it. And we'll talk about the example in just a second. So let's say your name is Rose, you're looking up. That's a pretty common English name. Okay, means a lot of things. So you can say Rose and a minus sign in front of the word flower, and that will reduce the number of times you end up with references to the flower. You can add words, like I may be looking for somebody with the name Rose who's in Quebec. This mostly applies when you're using a general search engine like Google. But this also applies when your last name is the same as a famous person. I have Presleys in my family. And if you try to search Presley, you're going to get Elvis, and Elvis, and more Elvis. You can also search with terms for the place you're looking for people. So you can go to the county or city level, or the ward when you're within a large city, or a census district, or even a street or street address. Siblings. Sometimes you're forgive me, that was my phone. Just get rid of it, Marie. If you have a common name and you're looking for a more unusual name in the family, you can search the sibling and find a lot of information that may apply. Just like, for example, I searched Veronica to find the 1920 census. So remember that the records are likely to be the same. Vital records, naturalization information may be applied to both. They're likely to have been born in the same place, lived in the same place, may have immigrated to the same place, will be listed in the same will, probably attended the same church. And often the obituary of a sibling will give you information like the married name of a sister. And it may be the sister you're looking for, not the person. This technique also can be used with neighbors, particularly for like the census records. Okay, now we'll talk about transcription. So people, real life people, transcribe written records. And so when they're doing that, there are a bunch of mistakes they make. One common one is you substitute the normal for the unusual. So you're looking at the record, and even though you can see it says Anna, you type Ann in the transcription, because that's just the way your brain works. As with any typing, you can reverse letters. Your spell corrector can correct you incorrectly. You can have typographical errors. There's a famous Supreme Court case decided on the fact that the actual typographical, the case was typed up as the word property. It was supposed to be the word properly. You can see neither one is going to show up in the spell checker. In something like the census, it's not uncommon, I mean, 1 out of 1,000 times, that the previous entry's last name will be entered as the last name for the next family. It's also not uncommon that the surname will be in the wrong place, particularly if it's a surname, if you had James Robert as the name of a person you were looking up, you might see it show up as Robert James. Whenever possible, look at the original image. It will tell you a lot more than looking at transcription. All right, we're getting toward the end. So this is taken from a report in 1848. The website here is Chronicling America. For those who have the desire to get into newspapers prior to 1920, Chronicling America is the place to go. Okay, so they were reporting on John Fremont's trip to the West. And included in the report was this letter that had been sent by the Secretary of State Buchanan to Fremont in Oregon. The bearer hereof, Mr. Gillespie, is about to visit, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, There's a technology which is called optical character recognition. You may wonder how people can actually search literally millions of pages of newspapers. And the answer is it's done using a technology, not transcription by human beings. So here's the transcription. My sir, the bearer here of Mr. Archibald, Roman numeral 2, Gillespie, ... from yours respectively, J.A.M.K.S. Buchanan. And then that whole last line, J.C. Fremont, Oregon, gets turned into this garbagey thing. So we do have optical character recognition to deal with for old newspapers, for directories, and some books. It has the issue of poor quality of print. Remember, if you were a newspaper reporter or typesetter, you would hyphenate things at the end of a line. And optical character recognition has to see that. And then, of course, it has no context for dealing with names. All the great artificial intelligence stuff of the world doesn't help if you're trying to get a common name. Okay, a couple of final items. I find for hard to research names that I use Google more, not less. One of the reasons is because Google loves to search on lots of information. So you can basically say, I'm looking for Veronica Kutkowski in Providence, Rhode Island, living on McDonough Street with her husband, Isidore. Okay. And Google will eat that up. It'll spit you back at anything it can find. One fallback I've done is to search only the first name on a Google with all the other information you can gather. The first name is more likely to be correct. Another thing you can do is find other people with the same last name and see what they have for spelling variations. You can do that by going something like family search, putting the last name in, seeing what comes up, and saying, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that would come up. All right, finally, remember, the original information may be wrong. So you may be, for example, interested in finding the burial place for a particular person. And so you know the year they died, and you'll search that year. I normally search 2 years on each side. And I don't know why I do that, but I find more things that way. But I'll tell you one of the reasons. My dear Aunt Ruby married late in life, and when she married a man who was 2 years younger than she was. And there was no way she was going to tell him that she was older. So for her purposes, she changed her birth date. So when he died before she did, okay, then when she died, she insisted that her sisters put the wrong birth date on the tombstone so that forever she could be younger than he was. There you go. Okay, next meeting is November 15th. That's a week early. And then December 20th, that's a week early. And we probably will not have a meeting in January. Next topic is immigration. And I'm now going to stop sharing and open up questions. Okay, who's got a question they would like to dig in? You can type it in, you can raise your hand, you can...
George, Peggy here.
Hi, Peggy here.
Hello. One thing, when you had the asterisks up after barred,
Yeah.
would it also pull up Bardenheim and
You bet.
more, so you could get more than your Kowski group?
Oh yeah, you would get lots of stuff.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but let's say what I did was I put barred exclamation point, and I wanted people in Lynn, Massachusetts. Okay, Lynn, Essex County, Massachusetts. Okay, between the years of 1910 and 1920.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not going to be a humongous list.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's the kind of place I would use it. I wouldn't use it by just starting off and throwing it at the wall. I
Okay.
try to put as much other information as I could. Okay, other questions, thoughts? There's Steve Spillman. Hi, Steve. Rory, you're new. You're unmuted now. What you got?
Well, I was fascinated by what you said about siblings. And the reason is in my family, my grandfather's name is Vito, which is all over the place in all the New York City records. And so I've been using clusterings of family names, trying to find people. But sometimes I come up and I find names that I don't even know as a sibling, yet it seems like the rest of the cluster is okay. Or you'll have a cluster and one of the names is missing. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, often if things look like they're approximately correct, okay, I'll research that other name itself to see if I can detect what happened there. You follow what I mean? So,
yes.
So I'd like to know more about that person. You're new to the group. People who've been here know this. I research all of my family's first cousins. So I go not only to the siblings of my own ancestor, but I go to their children. Okay. And by doing that, I get a tremendous spread of information about names, naming sequences, and all the rest. And what will happen often with immigrants is you're going to have, you know, on the Polish side, okay, my grandfather's obituary said one of his pallbearers was Stanley Kaniset, okay, be one of his half-brother's children, okay. There is no Stanley anywhere in the other records, okay, but there is a Stanislaus, okay. Well, pretty obvious that Stanislaus is going to be Stanley. And I, for years, have had one of Stanislaus's sisters as Sophia, which is her birth record. And I've been corresponding with her daughter recently, and her daughter sent me a picture of Sally, okay? And there's not a single record I can find where the name Sally is used. But she said her mother hated the name Sophia, okay? Everybody who knew her called her Sally. Okay, so don't be uncomfortable if you can yeah. Okay, other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of times, because I find, let's say, a first name, I'll find 3 different variations on 3 different records. And I wind up putting all of them in the person's profile page. And I never knew for sure if the algorithms looked at all 3 of those names, or if they only looked at the first one or the last one. Do you know?
Well, if you're talking about the automated algorithms?
I'm talking about like on Ancestry, if I put in 3 different first names, you know, 3 different variations of the first name, when they're looking for records for that person, do they look at all 3 of those names?
I think the correct answer to that is I'm not sure.
And the same thing with the last name, you know.
Yeah, I will tend to do separate research. I will tend to do, and that's also where I use the asterisks and the question marks. Okay, so I've become aware of the fact that Isidore has a bunch of different spellings, but no matter how hard you try to think you've figured it out, okay, you're not going to get the one that starts with Y, okay, YSID, okay, just until you've seen it. Once you've seen it, you could say, oh, okay, now I understand it. But now, for example, with those weird spellings for Kenneset that I put up, I've searched each of those individually. I've searched each of those individually on Google. Okay. And some of them are weird enough that you know, that's fine. I just throw it up on Google and see if I get anything at all.
So in order to search it on Ancestry, do you change the name each time you do a search in
I do
on
if
that
I'm,
person's profile page?
if I'm being really intense, yes. Okay, and I tend to focus one person at a time, get as much information as I can, try to work around it. For many years, one of the three half brothers was partly mythological because he had lived in the building next to the other two brothers in Lynn, Massachusetts when he first came over. And I couldn't find a link that absolutely locked down that he was a half brother. He might have been a cousin, he might have been some other relationship. And finally, I put in one of these weird spellings and up pops his marriage record with the names of his mother and father, which were the same as everybody else's. So I knew I had the right person. Okay, Sally.
On how you show the clusters when you go into Google search. Usually I just put a primary name or target name, and then I put a plus to get other people on that cluster.
Right.
How do you do it?
Yeah, I'll do whatever seems to make sense. Okay. I use the pluses, I use the minuses, I use the quotation marks. Okay. For example, I know that John Kenneset was frequently John Anthony Kenneset. Okay. There are records that have his full name as John Anthony. So I'll go to Google and I'll do quotation marks, John Anthony Kenneset, end quotation marks. Then I will do John A. Kenneset. I mean, I'll just keep going. And you can do it pretty quickly. Okay. Particularly if you're talking one of our wonderful Eastern or Southern European families where you don't have 3,000 Smiths in every city in the country.
Mhm.
Another part of that I wanted to ask about is the when you have a Thomas the second, Thomas the third. I noticed that the different websites, I can't tell because it's important whether he is, you know, my targeted person's son or grandson. I want to know that. And
I think the short answer is you frequently find yourself working with indirect information to give you what you need. Okay, so I have a John Kenneset living in Providence that I know is related into the family, but he is participating in high school sports. Okay, and I find him in newspaper accounts. Okay, so I sort of don't think he's the 55-year-old guy who came from Poland. Okay. Okay. Other questions, comments? Roger.
Are there any special research techniques for researching Native Americans and Native Canadians? Do they have first and last names?
I think it is so specific to the geography and the tribe that you almost need to research, to do the background research, to try to understand how people were named and what was going on. In a way, it's a little bit like the problem with ex-slaves. Okay, that the name that they use is very difficult. I've got a one of my, I think it's fifth great grandfathers had for a while a woman who was an Indian who was a slave, and then she got freed because Indians couldn't be slaves. She was able to prove she was an Indian, and therefore she was freed. But she took his name because all she had was the first name of Rose. That's all anybody knew her by. Okay, I have a question over on the chat from Sherry. If she's still here. There you are. Hi, Sherry. Do you want me to just repeat it, or do you want to say it?
Oh, well, I'd be happy to say it. In my husband's side, they are French Canadian. They pioneered, some of the first pioneers into Canada. And when Antoine came into Canada, it was Goulet. And it was for several generations until they moved to, part of the family moved to Vermont. And in the census, I can see where the parents' name are still Goulet, but the children were given Gouler as the last name. Is there a way to find out why they did that?
Nope. I mean, unless you can find some actual record that would have that.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no obvious way of doing that. One of my favorite things in my wife's family is her French Canadian family name was Menard, which became Maynard.
Right.
And there is a tombstone in Connecticut where on one side are Maurice and Onesme, M-E-N-A-R-D.
Yeah.
And on the other side is their son, Francois Xavier Maynard, M-A-Y-N-A-R-D.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, you know, and I would say in that case, as I do frequently find, do check and make sure that everybody changed their name, because it's possible that other members of the family did not.
Right. Yeah, I'll have to look for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it may have been a highly personal thing.
Yeah, and I wonder if there were, I've tried to find political issues of the time. I couldn't find anything that was a catalyst of history. So I don't know.
Have you Googled the name Gouler from the same time period to see who famous people would be?
Yeah, and there are quite a few. There were big families, and they spread out into Minnesota and into New York, and they're in Southern California. They're all over the place. But there's a lot of variations from the original Goulier when they came into America. And I'm thinking they must have just Americanized the name, and different regions picked up different spellings. I don't know.
Well, that happened, and it's hard to figure out why.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, any
Thank
other, Peter?
Okay. You know, I just have an opinion on this. I think the other reason someone would change their name is how it's pronounced in French Canada and how easily that is repeatable in, you know, English America. Maynard is how it's pronounced, George's wife's family in French Canada. And it's hard sometimes for people when their names are constantly mispronounced. So that's one thought.
And you also, whether without knowing which side of the equation it might be on, you also have people who change their name because there's a negative connotation to the old name.
Yes.
And then you have people who change their name because they become more a part of society and they want to be presented as part of that. When Francois Xavier Maynard, who became Frank Maynard, okay, made that change, he was actually a fairly wealthy man, okay? And it may have been that one of the reasons for the change was, you know, it made sense for him to be Frank Maynard now.
Right.
Okay,
George, can I ask you a personal issue? So my great-grandfather, whose last name is Krohn, K-R-O-H-N, I cannot find anything beyond him. And when I do a search, I get hundreds of names from Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Norway, etc. So I imagine I can somehow, by putting it in quote, well, no, because if I put in his first name, unfortunately, was Adolf, which isn't a very popular name anymore. But if I put in Adolf Krohn, I'm only going to get people with that name. Is there a way to eliminate the Scandinavian versions?
If there are 2 or 3 common first names, you can always, in a Google search, you can always put a minus sign in front of them, get rid of them. If you are talking about US records and searching in like Family Search or something, I tended to focus on geography very heavily.
So how would that work? He was, you know, from Germany.
Yeah.
Would you put in Krohn and then put in the name of a town, or?
Well, do you have the immigration record?
No, he never immigrated.
Oh, it was his son who immigrated?
Not even. It's his grandson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's my great grandfather. Yeah.
Okay. Gee, on most of the search sites, what you can do is you can put in a geographic limitation. So you can put in Germany. You can search on Family Search and say residence Germany.
Okay.
Okay. And that gets rid of all the Scandinavian
Okay.
folks.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, now next time we're going to tackle immigration. I'm going to give a little bit of my standard spiel on what immigration looked like through Ellis Island. Those who have not seen that already will be able to cover that. If you have a specific immigration question or story you would like to tell, okay, let me know, because I'd like to set aside time to deal with those specifics. Okay. Thank you all. Go enjoy the sun. The sun is out there and we've had rain.
Yay.
Thank you, George.
Okay. Bye all.